All right, bright good morning to everybody. And thank you for joining us for our webinar on managing the impact of floodwater on vegetable garden produce and soil. I want to take just a minute to give you some tips about using Zoom. We'd ask that everybody turn your audio and video off except if you are asking a question. And there's some directions on the screen about how best to do that. We also have a chat capacity. So if you have questions or want to make a comment, you can do that via chat, or you can do that via voice if you want to. The chat you access by taking your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, and the toolbar comes up, and there's a chat right there. We have a great lineup of experts to speak with you today, both from Duke University, from the Superfund Research Program, and from NC State Extension. My name is Lucy Bradley. I'm the Extension Specialist for Urban and Consumer Horticulture, and I'm going to be your facilitator, and I'm delighted to be your hostess. So here's an agenda for what we plan to cover. We're going to start off with Dr. Ben Chapman, who's a food safety specialist, talking to us about what do you do immediately? What do you do with the produce that's there? What can you eat? What can you not eat? Then Dr. Carl Crozier, who's a soil scientist, is going to talk about how to manage potential bacterial contamination. And we'll follow that by information from the Duke team on how to manage chemical contamination. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Chapman. He is, as I said, is a food safety specialist here at NC State. He is one of the driving forces behind the food safety guidelines for school and community gardens. There's a picture of that on your screen, and also a link to that, which is an awesome tool both in and out of floods. So Ben, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Great, thanks a lot, Lucy. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a few slides here to get us started. So I guess first of all, I just wanted to say this is one of the one of the tougher things I think that we have to do in cooperative extension when it comes to food safety, because not only are we dealing with things that people have put a lot of time and passion into, but they also may be dealing with other aspects of food insecurity. And this is one that that I think as we answer questions around food safety, we have to keep the situation in mind that there's already a really highly emotional response when it comes to disasters, and sometimes that leads to I guess additional issues when it comes to responding to technical questions. And so I'm going to provide everybody really the science behind fresh produce and flooded gardens, and how to really assess safety, or at least do the best that we can. And I'm happy to take any questions on this and sort of talk about it as we go along. So the first thing I want to kind of highlight is give a little bit of science on fresh produce, and really talk about microbes. My focus, is probably apparent from the information that we've shared in the past in the Growing Safer Gardens document, is really around microbial food safety. So bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And from a microbiological standpoint, we look at a tomato as a relatively smooth, fresh produce item. But in reality, there are millions of tiny crevices where pathogens like to attach, and they like to stay very attached, and so much so that it's very difficult to wash them off, whether that's on the calyx, whether it's on a stem scar, whether it's on the surface of the tomato itself. Once a pathogen is there, although we won't be able to see it, they're fairly protected, and that becomes the real problem that we have when it comes to floodwaters. We can move forward to other types of things that we may see in gardens, leafy greens, fresh herbs, where it may be a little more apparent on crevices and where things might like to attach. I put cilantro up for one reason right now is it represents, if we look at in non-flood times, if we look at the likelihood of pathogens, human pathogens being associated with fresh produce, cilantro really rises to the top of the list. It's the foods that I eat very consistently that I would say is the riskiest food that I consume. And it has to do with growing conditions as well as attachment rate. And so if there is any, if there are human pathogens there, for whatever reason, and we don't really know at this point why, but they really, really like to attach. And once they're attached, they're very hard to get off of cilantro. So thinking about that, that's really the source that I want everyone to think about is once it's there, we can do very little to remove the pathogen if we're going to consume this produce raw. And I'll get to that in a second. Another little piece of background is already in non-flood time, fresh produce is already, CDC estimates that it's linked to about half of our foodborne illnesses in the US. And so our best guess right now is we see about 48 million cases of foodborne illness a year. So about 24 million of those are coming from produce that we consume raw. It is already our number one sector, or commodity group sector, whatever we want to call it, linked to foodborne illness. Nothing else really comes close. And again, it's because we consume it largely raw. Anything that's come in contact with it in any portion of the growing phase, harvesting, preparation is only going to remain there when we consume it. So here's, I guess, the bad news when it comes to flooded gardens. It is extremely difficult for us to assess how clean the water is. And there are so many local issues that can lead to human pathogen contamination, whether that be a compost pile, whether that be close to animal waste, if that's domestic animal or wild animal. It is extremely hard for us to figure out how, quote, contaminated or how clean that water is. What we do know is that at following flooding events, and whether this just be in a summer rain or in a hurricane type situation, we do see an increase in generic and pathogenic E. coli, listeria, and Vibrio associated with floodwaters. And Vibrio is a really interesting one. It's one that we see, especially in our coastal regions, much more associated with brackish or saltwater. But inland during hurricane situations, we've seen this recently in the Houston area after Harvey last year, really high levels of Vibrio 5 or so miles inland, because with floodwaters, pathogens will move. We often associate Vibrio with raw oysters or fresh seafood, but we have seen multiple instances following flooding, especially coastal flooding of Vibrio in fresh produce and in other areas. And so the most conservative message is to discard produce that's destined to be consumed raw that exists there, because we don't know, we don't have a way to assess how clean or contaminated the water is. Soft fruits that are ready to be harvested should be discarded unless they can be cooked. And this is really coming from recommendations from the Food and Drug Administration, and in general, any produce where the edible part was directly touched by floodwaters presents a increased risk to health if consumed. Things that are a little more where we can get into some other discussions, plants where fruits have set, tomatoes, or where flowers are evident at the time of flooding present an undefined risk. That's really at this point the best we have. We don't have very good science on this. We have some laboratory-based work where it shows if we put a spike of human pathogen, Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria in a flower, and as it's growing, we can still recover that pathogen on the consumed edible fruit. But what we don't know, and this is the parts where it's hard to answer some of these questions right now, is how much needs to be there to be evident in the final product. Where we do have some interesting areas when it comes to flooding or underground vegetables, and this depends on where we are in our growing stage. But beets, carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes that are early in growth, at least 4 to 8 weeks from harvest, should be safe if they are allowed to grow to maturity. And in my sort of asking around to many folks in the horticulture sector right now over the last couple of weeks, this really isn't the case for us right now for many of the products. If it was an earlier sort of late summer, August flooding event, we may be in a good situation, but late September, early October, unless we've got some sort of late year harvest, it is difficult for us to assess the safety of the product. The other thing is canning produce in this situation really isn't going to do anything for us from a safety standpoint. What it can do, and other folks are going to talk about this later in the webinar, it can take care of some of our human pathogens, but when it comes to our potential for chemical contaminants, the canning is not going to reduce risk. Questions that I get right now from homeowners, from consumers is around washing, and washing does a little bit. And so in the world of microbiology, we talk in logs, and so those are factors of 10. So we would expect by washing a fruit and vegetable 1 to 2 log reduction, which would be 90 to 99%. If we use the sanitizer with that washing, so like a chlorine, bleach, or something else. Rinsing with water, at the most, we're going to get one log, 90% reduction. The problem with that right now is that we don't know, we don't have a good sense of if it's been contaminated, at what level. And so to give you a very practical situation, if we are at if there are 1,000 cells, which would not be out of the ordinary, of E. coli associated with a leafy green that we could harvest right now, by washing that leafy green, by washing that lettuce or fresh herb, I may reduce 100. I might take 100 off of that, leaving 900 that's out there. That would be a typical situation. And so it leaves a lot of risk potential in this area. So washing is really not very protective at this point. Cooking will give us a much higher kill, but again, it won't take care of anything if it comes to chemical contamination. We do have a fact sheet that was developed back in 2011 on recovering from a storm and flooding. We're updating this right now, actually this morning. So just this kind of steps through what's the risk, should all produce be thrown away, what about vegetables that are grown underground, can I preserve it, and what do I do if my garden is near a flooded area but not actually in the flooded area. And probably by later this afternoon, this will be posted at the website that I list here, foodsafety.ces.ncsu.edu/disaster preparedness. And so really steps through much of what I shared with you today. Lucy and others, that's sort of where I wanted to get to today. If we have any questions, obviously I'm going to stick around for the rest of the webinar. And I don't know if you want to take some now, Lucy, or not, however you want to handle it.
Sure. If anybody has any specific questions on food safety that you want to ask Ben while we're on the subject, feel free to unmute your mic and ask out loud, or to type something in the chat.
Quick question about using the root crops for seed crops next year, sweet potatoes and peanuts.
Yeah. So I'll give you like the real conservative protective question. I don't know. And it really comes down to that first area of not having a good sense of what the level of contamination was. It is likely going to be okay to do so because during the growing process, whatever is there with a contaminant, we're really strictly talking about human pathogens, should not be present through that entire growing season, both through the dilution within the soil and through the growing process. It just probably will not survive. But if this was something, if you're asking from a commercial standpoint, I would suggest that someone would go ahead and do some sampling of that seed stock to find out if there was what level of contamination you might be starting with before they make those decisions. But and I really hate to keep answering it. It was like, I really don't know. And the most conservative thing to do is to not use it.
Thank you.
And if they were contaminated by a chemical contaminant, then that would still be an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think others are going to talk about that
right
in a minute. But from a human pathogen, E. coli, Salmonella standpoint, that's
right.
one of the things that is where I would come at it. Is it's probably going to be fine, but I don't know without some sort of data. And I'm sorry it couldn't be better news.
I'm in an area that had marinas around us. I think I'm going to have the chemical contaminant problem, so I probably need to err on the side of not using them.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat, Ben. Is there anything that needs to be taken into consideration regarding soil for planting that has experienced full flooding?
So it's a great question, and it's similar to what we would see in a situation where we are using uncomposted animal manure. I'll use that as an analogous situation. In that situation, from a human pathogen standpoint, I would assume that you're going to have higher levels of pathogens that are deposited in that soil. Fortunately, the human pathogens don't survive very well over time in soil, and so with UV from sunlight and with sort of a normal growing season, they will get diluted. It's not to say that we're going to be at sort of zero risk by the time harvest comes around next year, but what we do with animal, when we know that there's contamination, or we assume that it is that we look at a 90-day interval between soil incorporation and harvest to reduce risk to levels that would be low public health risk. So if we're looking at a year from now and no further flooding, I would suggest that the soil is no less safe than it was before the flood event. That doesn't say that it's zero risk. It's just the flood impacts will subside really within 90 days or so. From a bacterial standpoint, that all bets are off when it comes to chemical contamination.
Right, and we'll be addressing that in just a little bit. Any other questions for Ben?
I just have a quick question. This is Brian from Duke. Ben, thank you for a great talk. I'm wondering that since we're talking about these precautions that need to be taken by gardeners, and it kind of sounds like you can't really keep too much. If people ask us, well, what are farmers doing? Is it pretty similar? I mean, or are they able to take different steps using, kind of tactics beyond what a home gardener might do?
Yeah, no, it's extreme. It's very similar. And in fact, most of the information that we have for gardens is derived from FDA's, the Food and Drug Administration's assessment of flood food safety. And so I put it into the chat, but not to everybody. I will send a link here to everyone that is from FDA that steps through how the the growing industry needs to approach floods. And in fact, they're very explicit about what is adulterated and what isn't. That has a legal term. And so in early on in that document, when they part 3, section A, they talk about if it's been exposed to floodwaters, it is considered adulterated and would not enter commerce. It would, in fact, if it did enter commerce, it would be against the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So yeah, I mean, great question. This is really analogous to what we would see in the food system. And truthfully, unfortunately for both home gardeners and the growing industry, that the news is not good. I mean, there is very little that we can do to salvage this product unless we know, what the level of contamination was in that in those floodwaters. The better news is that by this time next year, when we are at harvest, or maybe earlier in the season next year, we shouldn't be at any higher risk from a human pathogen standpoint.
And there's another question in the chat. If a pond that is used for irrigation was inundated with floodwater, can it be used?
Great. Another great question. Without having some microbial testing of that irrigation water, I would suggest no. There are guidance. There's a guidance document that EPA has, that FDA has adopted currently when it comes to irrigation water, as sort of a baseline standard that I can share some information in the chat box as we go forward here today. But it essentially has a process for multiple testing over, depending on how often the water is used, weekly or monthly, to look at what contamination levels look like, and sort of gives a path to okay to use. But without any microbial testing, I would say no.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Really appreciate your being here this morning and sharing all that information.
Thanks, Lucy.
Sure. I want to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Carl Crozier is a soil scientist at NC State University. He is the author of the Soil Fact Sheet on minimizing the risks of soil contaminants in urban gardens, and I put a link down there, and I'll post it in your chat box so that you can copy it to that tool. And Dr. Crozier is going to be talking about bacterial contamination of the soil and what we need to be thinking about there. So Carl, let me stop sharing and give you the floor.
Okay. Good morning, folks. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint and then probably turn my video camera off, but I figured I'd pop it on once just so you know actually here. So let's see. And I will be repeating some things Ben mentioned. And let's see. Oops. Give me a sec.
Yeah, let me just point out while Carl's getting his screen set that I'm posting some of the links in the chat, because I know you can't copy them easily. You'd have to type them out from the screen. So you can copy and paste from the chat to capture some of these resources that are being introduced.
Okay, so is that a good screen image there?
Absolutely, that's
okay.
Perfect.
All right, and just some of what I've got is photos, and I think they illustrate some of what Ben talked about.
Actually, let me just interrupt, Carl. It looks like we may be missing the bottom line, or maybe that's just me. Can you guys read text underneath the images? I see the top of, there it is. Great.
There it is. Okay.
Got it.
And again, the way I approach this is a little bit of a kind of a diagnostic thing. We've got many different scenarios that could have happened during the floods, different crops, different growth stages. And let's see. Oops. Okay. There's I didn't look exhaustively, but just a quick scan. There's quite a few resources, and as soon as you put this down, you find out you've missed some. But there's a lot of similarity among different university publications on what to do. So we can discuss these during the morning, but just let people know there are quite a few sources of some of the basic information. And let's see. Lucy did mention one that we've got, this one. We had prepared this a few years ago, and what's listed there are the sections that we use in describing contaminants in urban garden soils. And I'll go through those, but I will qualify it by saying these are general principles. And we didn't really write this thinking about flood biological contamination. So some of those are going to be more relevant than others. And I think what we're, for the purpose of this talk, what we're really talking about on the exposure routes is, is whether or not a person is eating or consuming soil. And that can be, either soil that's adhering to a fruit, vegetables, or skin, or eating the produce that's absorbed the contaminants. And of course, the site characteristics are important. There's lots of different things that can happen in the flood. Some of the information sources talk about the difference between ponding and flooding. And I'd say ponding is your own localized rainfall not running off and expanding and flooding it, versus an adjacent body of water like a river rising and flooding your site. And I don't know that that's going to be real. I don't know that that's going to be real critical for determining whether or not there's a biological contaminant, because you could have that from either one of those sources. Bottom left, that's actually my home garden during a hurricane, and it's adjacent to a dog pen, and it's adjacent to whatever's in the neighbor's yards. And so you've got an opportunity for miscellaneous things to just be floated into the garden soil. The other photos I've got from different sources. In the very top right, the three on the right are all from just after Florence, and the top one does illustrate flooding from a storm surge from, in this case, a brackish water body, a town in Hyde County. There's river flooding on a residential home in the middle, and then what could be in that shared watershed bottom right would be a flooded poultry farm. And again, that could all be that same water basin. So what's your likely contaminants? I didn't even try listing, because I went to one food safety thing and it talked about dozens or perhaps hundreds of possible contaminants. Ben knows about that. Again, he mentioned the bacteria, viruses, parasites. Could come from raw sewage, municipal sources, or septic fields. North Carolina does have a pretty high rate of residences that have their own on-site septic fields. Raw manures, whether from domestic or commercial animal production, dead animals, and then a really vague category, any sediment and organic matter that washes in from adjacent areas. And, characterizing the site, there's going to be sort of a complex of, how's the soil affected, what crop do you have, and what growth stage. These are just some pictures that I got from different websites. We've got leafy greens. We've got a tomato that's prior to flowering fruit set, and then a tomato with mature fruits. And again, those could all be different in terms of the risk to consumer. Now, we do talk about soil testing when we talk about contaminants, and I'll admit right away, they're either not available or not practical for all these potential biological contaminants. So since we don't have that, we're sort of left with these general strategies. And again, you know, the safest is don't consume anything, but there's always a wonder, well, is any of it safe? And then if it's not safe now, you know, how about replanting? And a couple questions have come up already. I'm going to skip over this. It's kind of a repeat, and this is one Ben mentioned, and it's listed in several of the websites I mentioned on, you know, what are some of the food safety risks. And let's see. So Lucy, I'm not getting slide. Okay. So anyway, and if there is interest in discussion, you know, are these safe to consume? This is a good time if anyone wants to chip in. I guess if I'm looking at the top left, I'd say if those are leafy, I mean, is that going to be, unless that's going to be cooked, that's a pretty clear unsafe. That middle one, now if that soil dries out and that tomato plant survives and then has flowers and fruits, you know, that might be safe. The bottom right, you've got mature fruits. It looks like a very high likelihood that there would have been splashing on them. So again, unless that's going to be cooked tomato, that's probably not safe. This is where I think some of the soil expertise questions might be, you know, what do we do for replanting since we don't have a biological test for soil? I kind of break it down into, you know, physically repair the site. It's going to have to be dry enough to, you know, either, you know, walk or in there and work the soil. If this is just biological contamination, not chemical contamination, then that residue can probably be incorporated. There may need to be some thought to, if you've had deposited sediment or if you had erosion, you know, how do you repair your surfaces? And I have seen a general guideline about not composting residue. And maybe Lucy can chime in on that. I'm sure that's the case if it's chemical contamination.
Right.
If it was biological contamination, you know, it's possible that in a several-month compost process, that
exactly
risk would abate. So there's a physical repair, there's a time issue, and Ben already mentioned this. Just as again, there is no test, but the National Organic Program standard for using raw manures, which are non-composted, is either 90 to 120 day interval. He mentioned 90, and I believe that's if the edible product touches the edible product does not touch the soil, and it's actually 120 days if the edible product does touch the soil. So that would be a frame of reference for how long to wait, and that's not how long to wait to replant, that's how long to wait until you would harvest the next product. So you could replant sooner than that and plan the time based on the crop. A general consideration of soil health would be, you know, consider planting a cover crop or ornamental crop before you have your next food crop. Then if you do that, you really don't have to worry about that waiting time. You really only have to wait until the soil's dry enough to work. There's miscellaneous types of crops in that list. And again, if they're not going to be consumed, then you're really just planting something to improve your agri-ecosystem, and you're not risking contamination of consuming that. And again, I'd be just the soil fertility. It's going to be more unpredictable after a flood than after normal considerations. So you would want to sample it, verify land and nutrient needs. And that's just a repeat of those resources. I'd open it up there for any questions. But, that is all.
Okay, so feel free to unmute your mic to ask questions live or to type questions into the chat, whichever you'd rather. These would be related to bacterial contamination of the soil and how to manage that. Okay, well, hearing none, you guys can feel free to ask questions later too if they occur to you. At this point, I would like to introduce our team from Duke. We have the joy of working with these guys in community gardening projects, and thrilled that they agreed to come join us to share information about chemical contamination from floods. They're with the Superfund Research Center at Duke School for the Environment, and going to turn it over to Catherine after I tell you about the incredible website. Sorry, I put that on there to make sure I saw it, but there's a link at the bottom, and I'll post it in your website. There's a whole website of resources and tools that are useful to community gardens, and so also to home vegetable gardeners. So Catherine here, sorry.
Oh, thanks so much, Lucy. It's great to be here. And thank you for the previous presentations. Those were really helpful. I'm gonna, while we're getting our slides set up here, we have several people here in the room from the Duke University Superfund Research Center. And I'm going to start out by introducing Dr. Elizabeth Shapiro-Garza, who directs our Community Engagement Core here at the Superfund Research Center. We're based at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. And Lucy, are you able to see our full screen now?
I see your screen, and I also see your next slide and your speaker notes. So if you want to narrow your band around the slide, we won't be jumping ahead of you.
Great. Okay. How's
Perfect.
that?
That's perfect.
All right. So we'll just go back a few slides and start at the beginning here. All right.
There they are.
Okay, well, it's really nice to be here. This is Liz Shapiro-Garza speaking, and I am here with 4 of my colleagues. So I'll introduce them in a second. They're the experts in this field, and they're going to be presenting the majority of this presentation as well. But again, Lucy, thanks for the invitation to present, and thanks to the previous presenters too. We actually just learned a lot, and we're taking a bunch of notes, so thank you for that. So we're actually talking today about dealing with chemical contaminants in vegetable gardens, flooded vegetable gardens. So I am here with my colleagues at the Duke University Superfund Research Center's Community Engagement Core. We have Catherine Castleman here as our program coordinator, Brian Lukanen, who is our senior program coordinator, Sam Cohen, who is our science communications specialist, and Stephen Yang, who is a Master's of Environmental Management student and also an expert in this field. He'll be speaking as well. At the Community Engagement Core of the Duke University Superfund Research Center, we focus on helping to translate science that is produced at the center for people who are being impacted by the issues that we look at. And our focus is on early life exposure and later life consequences. One of the main projects we have, though, as Lucy mentioned, was working with community gardeners throughout North Carolina on issues of chemical contamination, trying to understand the issue, how big the issue is, what chemical contaminants we find in gardens, and then routes to exposure, and how to change behavior in a way that will protect people. So our agenda today is looking at potential health risks for vulnerable populations and pathways to exposure for chemical contaminants that may have entered into people's home or community gardens or school gardens from flooding from these recent hurricanes. We're going to talk about what you can do, actions to reduce exposure, and also Brian and Sam are going to demonstrate a really amazing mapping system that they have put together that have used publicly available databases to look at potential sources of contamination. So this is a way that you all can work with the gardeners that you work with to understand what potential sources of contamination chemical contaminants might be near their gardens, and then from that narrow down what you might want to test for, or try and narrow down a little bit about what risks they might be facing as well. So just to say that in our community gardens project, and again, Lucy I think has sent the web link to our resources for community gardens in the chat, I believe. But we have been working on this project since 2016 and have a bunch of resources about chemical contaminants in community gardens. So if you want to check that out and get in touch with us if you have any questions or suggestions, that would be great. In general, though, we have worked in really close coordination with NC Cooperative Extension. I know a lot of you are with Extension. We love Extensionists, and thank you for being so wonderful and doing the work that you do. We've also partnered with North Carolina Community Garden Partners, which is an organization that Lucy and others in Co-op Extension certainly have been very closely connected with as well. So some of the resources that we do have already available for community gardens, you can see here there's a recorded webinars about soil contaminants in community gardens, pathways to exposure and how to protect yourself, a whole list of places to get your soil tested here in North Carolina, and a lot of other resources that I'm sure would be of interest to you all. We also have, as Catherine will mention, we put together a resource page specifically post-hurricane, not just for community gardens, but also for other communities that have been affected by flooding in particular, and around issues of chemical contamination. We'll be sure to share that with you as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on and just talk about some of these, the general overview of the issue, and then some of the specific health risks that we're concerned about for chemical contamination. So after a hurricane, as we've discussed, there's an increased risk that the public's going to be exposed to chemical contaminants that can harm health. They're entering the environment due to the movement of the materials through flooding, and also through wind damage and spills that may occur. When I say chemical contaminants, I'm talking about things like heavy metals, arsenic, mercury, lead, which are really persistent in the environment, and also pesticides and other substances that are non-biological. So we already got a great overview on the biological contaminants. And so we're aiming to help gardeners minimize or reduce risk around chemical contamination. And this photo is the leader of our analytical chemistry corps, Dr. Lee Ferguson, from the Superfund Center, doing some sampling along the Neuse River near Goldsboro after Hurricane Florence hit. So one of the unique features of the center is this non-targeted analysis method that the analytical chemistry corps uses to actually try to help identify known and unknown substances with chemical markers. So we're hoping to be involved in the sampling efforts after the storm and really help to translate that science to communities that were impacted by flooding as well. Next I'll talk about some of the potential health risks. So this is really how, as Dr. Crozier kind of set up for us, how environmental health scientists think about risk assessment and particularly exposure assessment. So it really, the factors that the health risk of being exposed to a chemical contaminant might depend on would include how they come in contact, that pathway of exposure, the type of chemical contaminant, how much the person was exposed to and over what period of time, and the individual characteristics of that person. So things like age, gender, and thinking about sort of long-term low-dose exposures is the focus of our center. So not just things that might cause an acute health risk right away, but what if you're digging in the soil over time every single day? What if it's a child? What if it's a pregnant woman? How does that change the risk? So as Dr. Chapman alluded to as well, the chemical contaminants we're talking about here stick around for a long time in soil. So these are really persistent compounds that don't break down easily, and can cause health effects long after even cleanup and recovery is done. But if they adhere to soil particles, as we're going to talk to, there are some ways to try to manage those risks in the garden. So just to recap some of those pathways to exposure, Dr. Kocher mentioned these two, but you're basically talking about breathing, eating, or touching contaminated soil particles. And as we like to say, if you have been around kids in a garden, they will put handfuls of dirt in their mouth with no hesitation. So we're particularly worried about those direct doses of soil, but and trying to minimize kids playing and doing hand-to-mouth contact in dirt that might be contaminated. But also adults can eat that soil in unwashed produce or breathe in dirt particles, especially on unmulched pathways while they're gardening. Okay, so just to talk a little bit more about the vulnerable populations here. As I mentioned, certain contaminants here, we're worried about the early life exposures that can cause long-term effects. So lead is one of these particularly well-studied, well-documented contaminants that can cause health issues over a long period of time, effects on the brain, loss of IQ even. And that's where you'd be particularly worried about young children who would be likely to ingest a direct dose of lead, and there's really no safe level of lead in soils. And also for pregnant or nursing mothers, but really women of reproductive age from 15 to 44 is how the Department of Health in North Carolina thinks about it. So these are some populations to be particularly cautious around some of those individual behaviors and management choices in the garden. All right, and now I'm going to hand it over to Stephen to talk a little bit about some of these personal actions you can take.
Hi everyone, this is Stephen, and I'll be covering the actions to take to reduce exposure and health risk. And we've categorized into two areas: personal actions and garden management actions. And to begin, first and foremost, just be safe while cleaning up. Floodwaters may be intriguing, but there are many hazards to it. Some that we're most concerned about are biological and chemical hazards. And things that you can personally do is wear protective equipment such as masks or gloves. These to reduce exposures such as inhaling or even unintentionally consuming it. And to be even more safe, with gloves, be sure to wash your hands frequently during and after garden cleanup. And lastly, after you've done garden management, remove your clothes and shoes and clean tools before entering your house. You want to avoid dragging contaminants into your own home and perhaps exposing to others as well. And next we have garden management actions. And you need to discard and not compost crops contacted by floodwaters. If you compost it, it'll just return it back to the soils and just repeat the process. And also check for possible sources of contaminations such as industrial sites, machinery in your gardens or floodwaters, and also household chemicals. And my colleagues Brian and Sam will go over the map and potential sites to look for. And also before you replant, consider doing soil testing in new garden locations, such as not easily flooded locations downhill, or also designs like raised beds. And it could be really difficult to describe contaminants, but first and foremost, we recommend taking pictures of it. And even if you can't recognize it, you could share it with experts or authorities, but the most certain way to identify a contaminant is through testing. And the risks that we're most concerned about are the invisible, long-term, and low-dose risks, even though there are also prominent risks for after floods, such as Vibrio bacteria that could enter through your skin and small wounds such as ant bites.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So just to talk about some longer term actions, obviously, as Dr. Chapman mentioned too, you have to think about the whole situation, and food security is an important consideration. Thinking about whether this garden and just thinking about how much effort and time has been put into a garden, but ultimately, if there's a high risk of chemical and biological contamination, it's possible that gardeners will need to consider new locations, and also think towards the future about new sort of resilient design features and other management choices that could be used. So a group called Grow NYC in New York has a great guide on sort of some flood-proof, resilient design features that can be used in gardens. We'll introduce the map in a little bit to talk about how this could potentially be used for helping with new siting of gardens, putting them on a new location, and also some non-chemical options for mosquito and pest control to sort of reduce the risk around pesticides. And also that water quality guide that was shared might be a good resource for thinking about irrigation water sources, but just because you know the water that you initially used was from a safe source doesn't mean that it wasn't impacted by flooding, and it's good to look into that and check with local water resources about any impacts to water sources. So just some of the resources that we can provide, the map, we also have the local list of labs for specific testing that you might do around soil contaminants, chemical contaminants, the gardens website that was shared, and specifically this fact sheet, which we can share as well, the soil contaminants in the garden, should I be concerned. This was created more generally, not after the flood, but it still has some helpful guide tips in it. Okay. And just to mention a little bit more about soil testing, North Carolina State University's resource is a great one to start with, minimizing risks of soil contaminants in urban gardens, that Dr. Courier and Dr. Bradley created. But also, you know, thinking about the exploring the potential sources of contamination first as a way to sort of inform which contaminants you might test for, because testing can be expensive. It's not often done locally, and it can be time consuming, especially if you're trying to make quick decisions about how to move forward with the garden. And then also just we would recommend to continue to stay up to date with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's information about post-flooding incidents. They do have an incident response map, which is one of the layers that we have on our map. But the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality is doing a lot of the monitoring after the flood, so we recommend checking out their website for resources after a disaster as well. And just a few more specific resources to share. The TOPS FAQs. If you have questions about specific chemical contaminants, this is a great fast resource for understanding health impacts, how to deal with them, and getting more links to resources and agencies that can help. And the CDC Center for Disease Control's Emergency Preparedness Guidebook has a lot of good advice on cleanup after a hurricane and protecting yourself from chemicals. So as Dr. Bradley mentioned, we just put up this post-hurricane resource website on the Superfund Research Center page, and there's the link there in the slides. So we do have information about health risks, sources of contamination, a link to the interactive map that Brian and Sam will share next, and action steps for specific communities that we work with, including community and home gardeners, with a lot of these tips that we've just shared and some more. So I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Brian Lukanen and Sam Cohen, who are going to give a short demonstration of the map resource.
And let me just interject just a second before you start, Brian. If you guys can post some of those links, I wasn't able to keep up with you on all the wonderful resources that you're doing. So feel free to post those into the chat so that people can copy and paste them and save them.
Okay, great. Maybe we can do that during the questions period. We'll make sure to post some of the links in there.
Also, just to say, this is Liz Shapiro for a second, just to say that all of those links and more are on that one website too. So if you are looking for those resources, it's a good place to start. And also, you should always feel free to contact us if you have any specific questions. We can point you in if we don't know the answers ourselves, we can point you in the right direction.
This is so cool.
Okay, while Sam queues up the map, I am just going to give you an overview of how we got here. So we started our community garden project a couple of years ago, and began in earnest, I guess about a year and a half ago, after we got funding from NIHS to start our community engagement core. And the Gardens project, the goal of it was to engage with community gardeners in North Carolina to help them understand and deal with any potential soil contamination that they might have at their gardens. So we're working with a partner organization, North Carolina Community Garden Partners, that has, they're an umbrella organization that has like a statewide network of gardens. And we also worked with Lucy and other folks from Extension that have been really helpful. But we needed to, given the finite resources that we have, we needed to select groups of gardens to work with to help them understand what was near them. And, we also have a plan for long-term engagement with these gardens. So we wanted to find folks that were looking to have a long-term relationship with us. And one of the ways we decided to inform that decision was to look at potential sources of soil contamination that we could know about from maps, from existing resources that were available through GIS maps. And so that first map included several layers of map data from the North Carolina DEQ, including locations of pre-regulatory landfills, because prior to 1983, there were no regulations for landfills in North Carolina. So municipal and industrial landfills were commingled. And so we were concerned about those as a kind of long-term source of soil contamination. Underground storage tanks that have had incidents, that meaning that they leaked or they failed in some way. And we selected the medium or high priority underground storage tanks. Locations of dry cleaners, because they can often have solvent spills that can spread in a plume in the soil. The locations of brownfields across the state. So those are all from DEQ. And then we also looked at EPA data on the locations of Superfund sites across the state. Superfund is in our program's name, but it's not explicitly a part of our daily work that we work on Superfund sites. In fact, the Superfund Basic Research Program is intended to promote the type of research that can help inform cleanup and management and recovery and redevelopment of Superfund sites. So the research is geared toward that, but some of our work certainly involves Superfund sites, but our daily work is not directly with a specific Superfund site per se. But they are important for this map. We also included data from locations of hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. Those facilities are permitted, and if they're operating normally, they shouldn't have a problem for local soil quality, but mistakes happen, incidents happen, floods happen, disasters happen. So we wanted to include those as well. And then finally, we include the EPA toxics release inventory, which is a location of sites that have permitted releases of toxics into the environment through land, air, and water. And with those, it's unique because we're actually able to get a number as far as pounds of given chemicals that have been emitted at a site over a 13 or 14-year time span. So those are the layers that we started with. We used those layers to help inform our choices of community gardens that we worked with. We also used other criteria, such as gardens that were of a certain size and willing to work with us and interested in what we were doing and possibly had some issues. But this map is a really great tool for figuring out where things are in the environment and learning about the local context of your environment. So with the storm that came through about a month ago, and then we had the one about a week ago, this appears that it's going to be a long-term issue we're going to have to navigate. And so we, Liz and Catherine and Sam, kind of led the development of these additional resources for people to deal with flooding. And so I'm going to let Sam talk about the additional layers that he's added to the map. and then kind of give you a tour around the map. What we did here was take that existing garden map and then try to add layers to that that might be particularly of interest given flooding. And so locations that would maybe normally operate just fine or not be a huge issue, but after flooding we would really be concerned about them. And then we also have some interesting kind of emergency information and some flooding information. So I'll let Tim take over from here.
Great, thanks, Brian. Like he said, I'll talk a little more about some of the additional data layers we have here within the map. But first, I think I will just walk through how to use the map. This is normally what you'd see when you open it up. You have an About section on the left side of the screen that gives you some tips on what you can get out of this map, as well as some steps on how to use it, and that's what I'll go through now. And if you scroll down, you'll see a short paragraph on all the data layers that we have contained within the map. So right now you can see it looks like there's maybe 2 different layers of data being displayed right now. We have purple stars and yellow diamonds, and if you wanted to find out more about what those symbols were, you could hover over to the Legends tab, the Map Legend tab, and click on that. And that brings up, and you can see that the yellow diamonds are Superfund sites on the national priorities list. These are some of the highest priority and often highest risk sites in the country. And the purple stars are coal ash facilities in North Carolina as well. If you wanted to see what other data layers are available in the map, you could hover over the button just to the left of the Legends button, and that's the layer list. And if you click on that, you can see all the different pieces of information that this map contains. And you can probably see right now that most of these are grayed out, and that just means that at this scale, we're viewing the entire state right now. They're not being displayed, but if you were to zoom in, they would start to appear. And we just do that so the screen isn't totally littered with dots, because it would be overwhelming. And you can see once you get closer, all these layers start to appear. And you can also toggle on and off layers just by checking or unchecking their boxes. And yeah, and I think I will zoom back out to the default extent. You can just press that home button, and it'll take you back out to the state view. Now, if you're looking to type in your address or your where you work or whatever, if you wanted to see what type of sites are around there, you have 2 options. You can either type into this address bar in the kind of top of the screen here, and depending on, I typed in Wilmington, so it gives me a fairly zoomed out view of the city. If you typed in a specific street address, it would zoom down even further. Let's switch back to the map legend so you can see what these various symbols mean. And you can zoom in to wherever you want using that, or another option, which is pretty cool, is to hover over to this What's Near Me tool in the top right. And you can either type in again your address, or you can click on this little pointer and zoom to a spot that you are interested in. Let's just kind of zoom down into downtown Wilmington. I'll click randomly. And what this shows now, it has drawn a 1 mile circle around the point where I clicked. And it also lists now the various sites that are within that 1 mile radius. So you can see that there are 4 from the DEQ's incident response layer. There's 4 of them within that circle, and you can open them up and click on one of them, and it'll show you. It's kind of hard to see right now, but it'll highlight with a blue square where that dot is, and it looks like in this particular one there was an oil spill on a battleship just across the river from Wilmington. You can see that there's a number of brownfield sites as well within the downtown area, and you could find out more information on those. Many of these data points have links that you can click on that will bring up further information, regulatory documents, further maps, that sort of thing. You can also expand out the circle. If you want to look a little wider, you can look at 2 miles, 3 miles, and even 5 miles. And obviously, the farther out you get, the more sites that will become visible within that circle. Okay, I think that's the basics on how to use the map. Oh, and if you ever wanted to change the background of the map, say it's hard for you to see the specific layers, you could switch to something else that would maybe take away some of the street details or whatever, but really help you visualize the different sites in the area. Yeah, now there were a couple layers I think that Ryan didn't mention. We have a layer called Hurricane Florence Approximate Flooding, and this was brought together by, we brought in, basically they take satellite images of before and after, and they're able to use some fancy programming to estimate what areas might have experienced flooding during the storm. This brought in some of that effort from a group at the University of Colorado, as well as in the European Union. And this is, we included with a caveat that, this layer doesn't necessarily mean that these sites experienced flooding, nor that sites that aren't colored in this case red, didn't experience flooding. So this is, an imperfect science. I think particularly in urban settings, it's hard to go, it's hard to get a perfect picture there. You can also bring up the FEMA floodplain maps, which should show up. Yep. And these as well are a tool that you can use to approximate where flooding might occur. The blue areas, according to FEMA, have about a 1 in 100 chance of flooding each and every year. The orange areas have about a 1 in 500 chance of flooding each year. Those odds are maybe shifting, especially as we get more and more intense storms happening more often. And certainly if you're in an area that's not within these designated floodplains, it doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't experience flooding in a storm event. I think that's about it. Is there anything else we wanted to cover on the map?
I think maybe just talk about the few extra layers that have been added, the coal ash facilities and coal ash ponds, industrial landfills that are currently operating, and
Great. Yes. Thanks. Yeah, we've included a layer on coal ash facilities throughout the state. I think there are 14 separate sites, and if you zoom in to one of those, you can see the outline of the actual ponds where the coal ash is being stored. And if I were to bring up the FEMA flood map, I'd see that it's apparently just outside the 500-year floodplain. But if I bring up the Florence proximate flooding, it does look like it experienced some flooding, and we obviously know that from firsthand accounts that that pond experienced flooding. Let me bring up the industrial landfills layer. Okay. Maybe they're just nothing directly in Wilmington. In any case, the industrial landfills layer, again, we just thought it was important to include, in addition to the pre-regulatory landfill sites, just because in flooding events, you can have water leaching down into groundwater or brought into surface waters, and that's just something else we wanted to include. And with all these layers, I don't know if I mentioned, but if you do click on one of these icons, you can get that same pop-up information, and we've tried to include all the relevant info. And if there is a link that can lead you to more information, we've included that as well.
So just one final layer to mention the Hurricane Florence DEQ incident response. Someone from DEQ or someone have been or were collecting information right after the storm and kind of logging them on, seems like a handheld GPS device or, you know, at some kind of remote location. It's unclear, but the information there is non-groomed data, but we included it because we thought it might be really useful and helpful to provide some local context.
And some of the entries have more information than others, like this one that I had highlighted before. That's pretty useful. But if you do have some questions about that, we recommend reaching out to DEQ directly.
So one thing to say about all of this too, I think, is really that it looks pretty scary. There's a lot of dots on that map, but it's also really important to recognize that just because there's a dot in the map doesn't mean that the contaminants that are at that site will have been permeated out into the rest of the environment. With the flooding that happened during the hurricanes, that was a real risk. It increased the risk that those contaminants would be released into the environment in a much broader way than would normally happen, as Brian has said. But it doesn't mean that they did. So it's not what this map, the use of this map, I think at this point really is to give you a sense of what is around you, especially if you're looking at community and school and home gardens. And also to think about if the garden has been flooded and there was a site near you that was also flooded that may have had contaminants of concern, so think about what you might want to test for. So it would give you some indication of next steps. But not that you would know necessarily that those contaminants were released, but it might give you some indication of the kind of contaminants you would want to test for in the soils and the sediments that were left behind. And on the website that we have created, there's a lot of links to places where you can do that testing. Some of it's not cheap, so you do need to consider that, especially for low-income community gardens. But there are resources to be able to help figure out, to narrow down with the maps what you might want to test for, and then to figure out where to test for it. And I think with that, we're wrapping up. And we would love to take questions. We will send out that link to our main website for the post-hurricane response. That really does list all of the different resources that we've talked about. I think Lucy has already shared the link to our community gardens website as well. And as always, there's contact information on both of those websites. You should feel free to get in touch with us if you do have any specific questions. We're happy to either help you answer the question or point you in the right direction. So with that, I think we can take questions.
So I think all of our speakers are here. So if you have questions regarding any of the information about post-flooding management, ask away.
Hi, this is Donna
Hi.
in Wilmington. Okay. One of my neighbors is having some fungicide problems. This is about grass. It's not about crops or whatever, but he's also a master gardener student, just started last week. Okay. So he thinks I know everything. And so I know with fungicide that it can be spread by feet and what have you, but he's been treating it with fritolone. So I think fungicide happens quite a few, it happens after a storm, obviously. So I'm just worried about him over applying fungicide, trying to get rid of it. But does anybody have any advice on, I've looked up, I looked up research information, so I know how to prevent it, what have you too. But he's wondering about why it's spreading and not going away and everything. I don't know what timing he's done. I think he's just started treating it, so I think he's being impatient. But does
I think that's a great question, but it's not one that any of our guests today have expertise to answer for you.
Okay.
So
then I will take my Mississippi and my Texas A&M information and share that with him and go look at his grass this afternoon because he lives around the block.
Okay, and you're in New Hanover County?
No, I'm in Brunswick County.
In Brunswick County, okay. Well, Sam Marshall is the extension agent there, so he would be able to help you with that.
Okay, and he's teaching the class today.
Awesome.
So
I would say as a general answer to use the label instructions on any product.
yeah,
excellent
You're
point.
thinking about if there's over treatment or not, just look at what the rate is. And sometimes homeowners are familiar with the calculations and sometimes not, but that's one thing we could help them with is how to calculate a rate for a small area.
yeah, that's a good point. A very good point. I think I might give that to him as field work. Great, thank you.
Any other questions for the team? Well, if not, I want to thank all of our experts for taking the time to share information with us this morning. I have on your screen right now the link to the Duke Garden, Superfund Garden site, which most of the resources that we shared today are linked from, and also to the NC State Gardening portal. And many of the resources are also available from there. There's a section on weather and on flooding. This will be recorded, is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the NC State site. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.